Hello, and we're back. Okay, so, for anyone new to this, I've been covering a series of essays called Abolition for the People. They are a series of essays organized by Colin Kaepernick and Kaepernick Publishing specifically. The specific essay we'll be covering, I'm posting the link to, it is all about the case for police abolition, which is, I know, a loaded term. It is misused a lot. It is misunderstood a lot. So we've been trying to do a deep dive into these because, let's face it, a lot of people don't really care to do the reading. So I'm doing the reading, and this is kind of an open discussion format. So as we go along, feel free to chime in with thoughts, and I'll be interjecting from time to time my own thoughts as we go through. So, yeah, reading is hard. It can be. So, this is an essay by Dr. Dylan Rodriguez, who is he's a professor in the University of California in Riverside, which is where my mom's side of the family actually is from. He's written a couple books, Forced Passages, Imprisoned Radical Intellectuals, and the U.S. Prison Regime, and a book called Suspended Apocalypse, White Supremacy, Genocide, and the Filipino Condition. So yeah, he's very well versed on these subjects, as pretty much everyone in this series of essays is. It basically is, academics, lawyers, and just people with lived experience writing from different perspectives on police abolition. So this is continuing the section critical of the reform approach. So this is the magical thinking of reformism. Reformism isn't liberation, it's counterinsurgency. You can't abolish systemic anti-blackness and racial colonial violence by protecting the system itself. The logic of reform. Reform is best understood as a logic rather than an outcome, an approach to institutional change that sustains existing social, economic, political, and/or legal systems, including, but not limited to, policing, two-party electoral politics, heteronormativity, criminal justice, and corporate destruction of the natural world. To reform a system is to adjust isolated aspects of its operation in order to protect that system from total collapse, whether by internal or external forces. Such adjustments usually rest on the fundamental assumption that these systems must remain intact, even as they consistently produce asymmetrical misery, suffering, premature death, and violent life conditions for certain people and places. Before continuing, I have to say I really appreciate this initial framing, because that is one of the difficulties in having this conversation of the abolitionist perspective. People are conditioned to want to just tweak things and reform them and, fix what's broken. But that is predicated on the assumption that the entirety of the system is not actually broken. And that is, in this case, a bad assumption. in many of these cases. It's a poor assumption. And when you target reformism and you talk about it in these terms, yeah, it's better to be able to take that step back and say, is this a system that actually does produce a useful outcome that is worth protecting? It's a question that I think needs to be asked more and normalized more. While modern policing has emerged through the institutionalized violence of anti-Black apartheid and the long genocidal legacies of chattel slavery and frontier warfare, contemporary efforts at police reform nonetheless suggest that policing can be magically transformed into a non-anti-Black, non-racial colonial racist system. As the story goes, this white magic is to be performed by way of piecemeal changes in police administration, protocols, officer accountability, training, and personnel recruitment. This is very poignant here in Florida because we just passed a fairly toothless bill, which, among other things, took the bold perspective that we shouldn't be violently arresting people under the age of 7, and that we need to have some sort of basic standards of teaching officers what excessive force even means, which is like, okay, but first of all, that should have been taught all along. I'm glad you're teaching it now, but second of all, what are you actually doing when they inevitably continue to use excessive force anyway? There's nothing in the bill which actually addresses that question. It's just, oh, well, we just need to train them better because that's obviously the problem. So yeah, those are things that's what reform tends to look like, is very small targeted things that tend to be fairly toothless. Because, it's not actually changing the balance of power. The 8 Can't Wait campaign, widely publicized on social media by the nonprofit organization We the Protesters and its Campaign Zero effort during the early days of the June 2020 global rebellion against anti-Black police violence, exemplifies the foundational fraudulence of this magical ambition. Premised on the untenable, poorly researched, and dangerous notion that adoption of its 8 improved use of force policies will result in police killing 72% fewer people, the 8 Can't Wait agenda attracted immediate and widespread support from celebrities and elected officials, including Oprah Winfrey, Julian Castro, and Ariana Grande. Such endorsement are inseparable from the political logic of the non-profit industrial complex. The infrastructure of liberal philanthropy commodifies simplistic narratives of reform into tidy sound/text bites that are easily repeated, retweeted, and reposted by public-facing people and organizations. This dynamic not only insults the intelligence of those engaged in serious, collectively accountable forms of struggle against state violence, it also glorifies clout-seeking laziness as a substitute for actual abolitionist activism. This speaks to me on a very deep level, because this is kind of my own rallying cry. I get endlessly frustrated with this kind of new approach to politics as just distilling things down to simple to understand slogans, and that's it. That is the end of engagement and the end of thought. And like when I have tried to talk about, say, police abolition with some people, they basically want the whole idea distilled down to like a couple sentences, and it's like, no, that's not how this works. If you are serious about actually understanding the concept, so you actually know what you can advocate for and what real solutions look like, it requires a level of effort beyond that. It requires actually taking the time to do the learning, to do the research, to have those more difficult and more detailed, nuanced discussions. I understand in the social media age that it is very easy to have these real quick, quippy, slogan things and hashtags and whatnot, but it does really hamstring actual engagement and real efforts for change. And this goes beyond just police abolition, obviously. This goes to stuff surrounding pride and LGBT issues. It goes into various forms of challenging corporatism, all kinds of things. Even as 10-second engagement. Our collective attention spans don't last much longer. Exactly. And I challenge that. I ask, myself and you, my audience, basically, or my community, whatever. I don't really like to think of it as audience. I like to think of it as a community, but I challenge folks to actually engage with subjects more deeply. Yeah. One of the many let me pause before I continue on. I do think there is some value in having something that you can... I do think there is value in slogans. I don't want to completely discount them. They are useful for raising awareness. But once that attention is captured, there needs to be a next step. There needs to be follow-up. There needs to be actual education behind it. So I don't want to completely discredit like social media campaigns and things. I don't want to say that they have no value. Just wanted to make that clarification, but one of the many glaring problems with 8 Can't Wait, which advocates de-escalation, warning before shooting, banning chokeholds, and installation of a use of force continuum, is that many of its proposed policy reforms were incorporated by the most homicidally anti-black police departments in the United States well prior to the state-sanctioned killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others. Against all historical evidence, 8 Can't Wait attempts to convince those questioning and rebelling against a violent, misery-making system that policing is reformable, that it can be modified and refurbished to protect and serve the very same places, communities, and bodies it has historically surveilled, patrolled, intimidated, and eviscerated. This is a extremely important point. I want to repeat that part. Many of its proposed policy reforms were incorporated by the most homicidally anti-black police departments in the United States, including Chicago PD, before those killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others. We've seen departments that even ban chokeholds continue to use them. And we've seen what warning before shooting looks like. Usually it's a fraction of a second between the officer yelling something incoherent over other officers and then pulling the trigger. Advocating de-escalation, for example, without having teeth behind it in the event that de-escalation is not used, is meaningless. You can tell an officer whatever you want, but if he is not immediately and severely punished when he does not do that thing, then it's pointless. As Project NIA director and abolitionist organizer Mariam Kaba wrote in the June New York Times editorial, there is not a single era in United States history in which the police were not a force of violence against black people. A recent amicus brief in Harvard Civil Liberties Law Review echoes black radical feminist and abolitionist analyses like those of Kaba, Rachel Herzing, Alyssa Biera, Sarah Haley, Beth Ritchie, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore by considering how 8 Can't Wait amounts to a liberal reaction to an attempted appropriation of an emerging global mass movement that radically confronts the foundational, gendered, anti-black logics of modern policing. The brief suggests that Campaign Zero's decision to move forward with a middle-of-the-road proposal, just as abolitionist organizers have begun to garner increased public support in their demands to defund and abolish police, is questionable. Let's see. Donnie, and punishing those small efforts severely would be quickly seen as overreaction. Yeah. With how much cop worship we have, yeah, it would be seen as an overreaction. And right now, as we continue to see, it is impossible to hold any officer accountable unless you have a literal international movement against them. And even then, it's one officer. Derek Chauvin got 22 and a half years. Derek Hamilton was in prison for about the same time for a crime he did not commit. Russell Shoatz was in prison, well, has been imprisoned for, I mean, he was given a life sentence without possibility of parole for killing a police officer. If, these multiple thousands of executions by police every year require international pressure just to hold a single officer accountable, it's not possible to actually challenge them on this. And none of these reforms actually adjust how that accountability is enforced. None of them actually create a new community-driven oversight and control of the police themselves, which is what would be needed to enforce anything, because they're not going to do it themselves. And the courts will almost always side with police. They're incentivized to. It is vital to ask why such reform campaigns consistently emerge with special intensity in historical moments of widespread anti-systemic uprising. The 2020 global rebellions against anti-black policing, acceleration of abolitionist and proto-abolitionist organizing, and spread of black feminist and queer radicalisms in our midst are, as the late Cedric Robinson might say, a brilliant, messy, beautiful totality that seeks to overthrow conditions of terror. These conditions are both deeply historical and acutely present, encompassing the deadly forces of criminalization, housing and food insecurity, incarceration, targeted environmental toxification, sexual violence, and cultural demonization. Yet, reform movements tend to simultaneously obscure and reproduce normalized conditions of terror by deferring and/or repressing militant collective confrontation with the historical foundations of gendered, anti-black, and racial colonial state violence. Put another way, if the foundation of such violence is policing itself rather than isolated acts of police brutality, or criminal justice rather than the scandal of mass incarceration, then reform is merely another way of telling the targets of such asymmetrical domestic warfare that they must continue to tolerate the intolerable. It's getting to the heart of this is not just a few bad apples. This is the system logically following the incentives and disincentives that exist within the system's framework. The police brutality that we continue to see, unchanging year by year, is baked into the very foundation, the very structure of policing. And reform efforts do try to deflect away from that. What might it mean in moments of widespread rebellion against normalized conditions of terror to conceptualize reform campaigns like 8 Can't Wait as liberal progressive counterinsurgency? How do such reformist counterinsurgencies serve to undermine, discredit, or otherwise disrupt oppressed, freedom-seeking, Black, Indigenous, incarcerated, colonized peoples' growing struggles for abolitionist, anti-colonial, decolonizing, and/or revolutionary transformations of existing social, political, and economic systems? Right. There's an individual, I'm not going to name them, but I continue to have conversations with, Donnie knows them, who they refuse to acknowledge a need for abolition, and they refuse to actually do any research into the subject. But they insist that it is way too radical to talk about abolitionism, and that it just alienates voters to even bring it up, and basically tries to paint the entire movement as harmful. And in microcosm, I believe that's what Dr. Rodriguez is getting at here. That the offering of these toothless reform efforts by liberal progressive counterinsurgency is basically a way to paint those calling for real change as too radical, too extreme, too unreasonable, and is used quite effectively to shut down the conversation. It is maddening. And it is very appealing to people who, consider themselves reasonable, centrist, I want to consider all ideas and let's find a middle of the ground approach. Because taking such a position typically means that you don't actually have to think about anything. You listen to, well, there's some people that are having some complaints, and there's some people who say the system's working fine. Let's just tighten up a few screws and call it a good day. That's fine. We're done. Without ever actually really sitting down and getting into the weeds. It is lazy thinking. Almost seems pointless when those types undermine the attempts to make real change under the guise of realistic change, and then nothing happens anyway. Exactly. There are some people who are stubborn, like myself, who, are going to stick it out anyway and just browbeat until we're blue in the face. And then there are some people, a much larger coalition, who, because of the color of their skin, the way they've grown up, etc., they can't just ignore these problems. And that's really what it boils down to. The white liberal in this country can just ignore all of these problems. It is not aimed at them. So it's easy to make it an academic exercise of just, oh, well, that's just, these few things keep happening, so let's just, let's adjust our training. Let's add some new equipment. Let's add a few more systems onto this already massive, over-bloated structure of state terror and see what happens. Meanwhile, people are getting killed. A lot of people are getting killed. They're not people that look like me. But, yeah. It is very frustrating. You're totally right, Donnie. But I'm glad that the conversation at least is there. I'm glad that this series of essays exist. At this point, we're going on, I think, the 17th hour of discussing it in this context. So, yeah, let's continue on. Yeah, it's a good one. I'm enjoying this section in general because this, has been a struggle point for a while. Reformism. The ideological and political position that fixates on reform as the primary, if not exclusive, engine of social change/justice is another name for this soft form of counterinsurgency. Reformism defers, avoids, and even criminalizes people's efforts to catalyze fundamental change to an existing order, often through dogmatic and simplistic mandates of nonviolence, incrementalism, and compliance. What this is getting at is the condemnation, the constant condemnation that protesters face, which is another sore spot for me. It drives me mad when everyone's like, oh, well, those few acts of violence, the rioting, really casts doubt about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's like, are you fucking kidding me? What could possibly justify questioning something as simple as, can police please stop murdering black people? I don't care that a target got set on fire. That doesn't counteract the underlying message in any way. Not to mention the aforementioned parts that we've talked about, where riot is a thing that police declare when they want to escalate a non-violent protest into a violent one and justify cracking some skulls, as we see time and time and time again if you actually look at recordings of protests. And yes, the media is very complicit in demonizing protest movements. That also is frustrating. Moreover, Reformism sees the law as the only legitimate form of protest, collective cultural / political expression, and or direct intervention on systemically violent conditions. It is worth noting that the interpretation of violent versus nonviolent acts requires discussion and debate, particularly in response to oxymoronic notions of property violence that rarely account for gendered, anti-black, and racial colonial state violence. Reformism limits the horizon of political possibility to what is seen as achievable within the limits of existing institutional structures, electoral politics, racial capitalism, heteronormativity, the nation state, etc. Yeah. I will point out a little bit of history. I'm really enjoying this one. Yeah, I love this author, and I'm getting his books, and I am really eager to read them because I love the way this guy he doesn't pull punches. He's just like, this is all bullshit. You all know it's bullshit. I'm calling it out. But there is not a single social movement in United States history, and probably in the world, that did not necessitate illegal activity at some point in it. Widespread illegal activity. The whole civil disobedience thing is a form of protest. And yeah, you end up with a lot of people in jail through the course of this. The problem is, especially here in America, and I suspect that it's this way elsewhere, there is a cultural attitude that's been cultivated that anyone who lands in jail is can be instantly written off as criminal, radical. You know, they shouldn't be listened to. They're dangerous. They're a criminal. That's not necessarily true. White liberals' favorite hero, Martin Luther King Jr., ended up in jail multiple times. Bernie Sanders was arrested. I mean, these calling for change, especially radical change, will always butt you up against the state, and the state will respond with violence. This does not mean that those calling for change are in the wrong. Yeah, Mandela, Malcolm X, etc., etc. Absolutely. The women's suffrage movement landed with tons of women arrested. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks. It's another good one. Yeah, if you limit all of your political activism purely 100% to legal, non-disruptive avenues, you will not actually be able to affect any meaningful change. That is a fact. And if the white liberal majority of the country wishes for people to stick purely, Kaepernick is a great example. He's done a lot with his platform and has been able to affect a fair bit of social movement. I have huge respect for his efforts. But yeah, he completely had his career ripped out from under him. But I've said this before, but if the white liberal majority of the country wants people to stick purely to, legal, non-disruptive protest, that means that they have to take those protests seriously when they happen. And they have to take action at that time. Because not taking action means that it's going to escalate eventually. It has to, because the conditions aren't going to change on their own. So I do not expect that to happen, but it's like that. The burden is on the rest of the country, the apolitical, to actually listen up when protests happen, whatever form they take. And if they can listen when they're early and smaller, that's great. I would love to get to a position where people actually listen to marginalized voices. Yes, black people are only 13% of the country. They can't force change through electoralism on their own. They need the rest of the country on board. We have to listen. More people have to be able to listen to shit that they aren't experiencing in their own lives. Anyway, continuing on. I always skip over these because it writes these things elsewhere in the articles, so I want them in context. While abolitionist, revolutionary, and radical forms of collective analysis and movement frequently create irreconcilable confrontation with oppressive institutions and systems, reformism seeks to preserve social, political, and economic orders by modifying isolated aspects of their operation. A peculiar assertion animates contemporary forms of this liberal progressive counterinsurgency, that the long historical, systemic, institutionally reproduced asymmetries of violence produced by existing systems are the unfortunate consequences of fixable inequities, disparities, unconscious or implicit biases, corruptions, and or inefficiencies. In this sense, reformism presumes that equality, equity, and parity are achievable and desirable within existing systems. But as we have seen, the incentives in the systems are not there. There is no actual structural incentive to pursue equality, equity, and parity. The reformist counterinsurgency pivots on a fervent belief that the spirit of progress, national improvement, and patriotic belief will prevail over a fundamentally violent order. In practice, this belief approximates a form of dogmatic liberal faith, a kind of pseudo-religion. Thus, increased diversity in personnel and bureaucratic infrastructure, shifts in the legal and policy apparatus, and individualized anti-bias trainings ascend as some kind of, or as the principal methods for alleviating state violence. There is yet another layer of fatal assumption that structures the reformist position, that those targeted for misery, displacement, and premature death under the existing social order must tolerate continued suffering while waiting for the reformist fix to take hold. That gets at the heart of the whole, let's not rush things, guys. We have to stick with what's realistic and achievable. And, you know, we have to consider the current political climate and blah, blah, blah. And just shut up and continue dying while we tool around with the system and see what happens. Let's see. Are more of you dying with number 1 or number 2? Are more people dying with 2 or 4? Like, come on. Sidetracking from that, I'm reminded of a chart that I stared at for a while, which pointed out that police killings have been just rock solid steady for several years, including through the killing of Breonna Taylor, and that through the killing of George Floyd, and that, like, all of the hand-wringing and the random hodgepodge of reforms that have been implemented here and there have done nothing. They have resulted in a 0% decrease of executions by the state. There's no reason, there is no evidence to suggest that we can reform our way out of it. This is not a new problem, and it is not a problem that has... It is a problem that reformism has attempted to resolve for centuries, you know, for decades at least, to no avail. Yeah, the annoying optometrists of social change, exactly. I'm glad you got what I was miming there. So, abolition. An abolitionist analysis and collective praxis, on the other hand, offers an urgent rebuttal to the bad faith incrementalism of the reformist position. 2 parts of the spreading abolitionist response are worth emphasizing. First, that the internal logic of the existing social, political, and economic order, following Sylvia Wynter, let us call this civilization, amounts to a long historical war on specific peoples and places. The internal logic of the existing social, political, and economic order, or civilization, amounts to a long historical war on specific peoples and places. Second, that the transformation of such an order not only requires its upheaval, but also must be guided by the liberation, collective health, and self-determination of African-descended peoples, indigenous and aboriginal peoples, and other peoples and places targeted by the long history of civilization war. Considering the anti-black, genocidal, and proto-genocidal logic of racial capitalism, the U.S. nation-state, white supremacy, and settler colonial domination, reformism is not merely inadequate to the task of abolishing anti-black racial colonial warfare, it is central to civilization's expansion, sophistication, and deadliness. This is a uncomfortable point of truth for people, well, for white liberals especially. There is a prevailing attitude that we, the majority, know best because we just do. We built the country, etc. However, what we continue to see is when white liberals try to address these problems that are impacting people who are not white liberals, we consistently miss the mark. That cannot be overstated. It is not a problem that white saviors can sweep in and resolve. We have to be able to let go of the reins and actually listen to people who are not us. I say us because, you know, I am a white myself. From a programming perspective, this makes perfect sense, and I sometimes use these analogies from my professional life, but this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but if I, as a software developer, got, saw a ticket from someone that something was not working for them, and I kept trying to resolve it myself without actually bringing them in as the person that was affected or listening to them, there's no way to resolve that problem. That's kind of what it's like. You're just continuing to do things blind without putting those affected front and center to actual problem solving. You can't close a bug report without reading what the hell it says and actually resolving the problem and then making sure with the user that it's addressed. Like, it's a little bit of a rough analogy, but I hope that it gets something across. It's a way that I can think about things. It doesn't perfectly fit, admittedly. To be fair, some rare reform campaigns seek immediate institutional adjustments that directly address the asymmetrical casualties of anti-blackness and racial colonial violence. Abolitionist approaches to reform, for example, endorse short-term measures that defend the existence of vulnerable and oppressed people while allowing organizers, teachers, scholars, and other activists to build greater capacity to completely overturn and transform existing systemic arrangements. 8 to Abolition, the abolitionist response to 8 Can't Wait, exemplifies such a program of immediate local reforms, which include defunding and redistributing police budgets, decriminalizing survival-focused economies and communities, decarceration of jails and prisons, and universal access to safe housing. Yet the campaign nonetheless asserts that the end goal of these reforms is not to create better, friendlier, or more community-oriented police or prisons. Instead, we hope to build towards a society without police or prisons, where communities are equipped to provide for their safety and well-being. Reform is, at best, a stopgap emergency tactic that abolitionists undertake with principled suspicion. Let's see. What a point that even white liberals trend towards white supremacy because they think they know best, regardless of not actually knowing the problem intimately. Exactly, yeah. And those things, it's not, it isn't lack of compassion. It's just, it is this kind of cultural thing in white America, especially, of just asserting that especially white men know best and should be the leaders on everything. And if there's a problem, they'll figure out the solution. It continues to manifest in them being massively overrepresented in political leadership, business leadership, community leadership, etc., when they may not be the best candidate for the job. And it also, importantly, tends to minimize voices that are not them. Whether that just be women or, you know, non-hetero or non-white. And yeah, that manifests in all kinds of ways, even as just calling back for a job interview. So there are a lot of continued cultural struggles against that underlying point. It's a rough one, and it's hard to approach that with some people because, you know, especially white liberals, they do tend to say like, well, yeah, but you know, I do care and I want to do the, I want to fix the problem. And I read on Twitter that this is a good thing. So yeah, you know, I'm doing my part. And it's like, okay. I've never heard of 8 to Abolition. I would look into it. I mean, it's as realistic a goal as any sort of police abolition movement. It is at least a step in the right direction and kind of helps bridge the gap a little bit. They are positions that many would say are too extreme, but they do. This is one of those cases where it does give you a starting point to have those conversations, and I need to sharpen up on that particular movement myself, because I think that from looking at it, it might be a good bridge for people who are still on the reform train. This historical moment is marked by multiple obliterations of the reformist script. Growing numbers of people, communities, and organizations are unapologetically, militantly rejecting the contemporary social, political, and economic order. This is a time animated by widespread Black and Indigenous revolt, audacious visions of a future against and after civilization, and a disciplined mass refusal to surrender to the intimidation of right-wing reactionaries and the open repression of the state. Proliferating grassroots activity, language, thought, and collective learning expose the brittle ideological claims of reformism, which wilt in the face of the surging art, movement, and poetry of abolition, revolution, reparation, and radical community that defines periods like the summer of 2020. Readers of this and other contributions to Abolition for the People may already be engaged with such communities, but if they are not, they can likely search and find ways to link with such collectives with minimal effort. Otherwise, they can feel free to reach out to me at donrodriguez73@gmail.com, and I'll do my best to facilitate a connection. Finally, at a time when the United States is reacting to this insurgent, self-liberating swell of humanity by openly moving toward a 21st century of white nationalist fascism, it is helpful to revisit the words of Black revolutionary writer, teacher, and organizer George Jackson from his book Blood in My Eye. We will never have a complete definition of fascism because it is in constant motion, showing a new face to fit any particular set of problems that arise to threaten the predominance of the traditional capitalist ruling class. But if one were forced, for the sake of clarity, to define it in a word simple enough for all to understand, that word would be reform. That is quite a statement. Oof. But building on that, he's not wrong there. We didn't get to where we are overnight. It has been reform after reform, both in our electoral system and in our policing. At no point have we, as a nation state, as a people, even, been able to pull back from that collectively and say, there's something wrong with our democracy. Like, everybody knows the two-party system is broken. Everyone says it. On both the right and the left, everyone says two-party system sucks. What do? We continue to tinker, we reform, we tweak. We never say, this is fucked, we need to knock it down and try rebuilding it correctly with those lessons learned. Yeah. Band-aids on top of band-aids. And meanwhile, that just builds more and more strength to this underlying broken structure, which is known to be flawed and violent and trending in a, fascistic direction. So yeah, he's not wrong there. It does definitely continue to show up, reforms continue to show up as layers to bolt on to things that are just fundamentally not working. And it shortcuts any questioning of, is this system well-founded in the first place? It takes that off the table consistently. Doesn't matter what the issue is. And yeah, that will always benefit. That will always be to the benefit of the traditionalist. Ultimately, that is very appealing to fascists. Fatal and terrorizing state violence is not containable to isolated incidents. It draws from and actively expands a long civilizational history that is based on the evisceration and negation of Black life, the occupation and destruction of indigenous peoples and places, the criminalization of queer, trans, and disabled people, the flourishing damage of state-sanctioned sexual violence, and the stubborn omnipresence of violent misogyny, which are the everyday order of things under the conditions of normalized domestic war. Reform is, at best, a form of casualty management, while reformism is counterinsurgency against those who dare to envision, enact, and experiment with abolitionist forms of community, collective power, and futurity. Abolition in this sense is the righteous nemesis of reformism, as well as the militant, principled, historically grounded response to liberal counterinsurgency. Abolition is not an outcome. Rather, it is an everyday practice, a method of teaching, creating, thinking, and an insurgent, fugitive community-building project that exposes the pitfalls of the reformist adventure. It demystifies reformism's cheap magic and summons an embrace of the dynamic, black, radical, and revolutionary tradition that informs collective labors of freedom, structures notions of justice and collective self-defense, and induces a political and ethical obligation to fight unapologetically in whatever ways are available, effective, and historically accountable. Anything less is a concession to the logics of anti-Black and racial colonial genocide. Thank you, Dr. Dylan Rodriguez. This was a fascinating, very powerful read. Definitely one of my favorites of this series so far. He really cuts to the quick on what reformism actually is, as well as offering some direction on how to frame things to challenge reformists, which will be a continued, ongoing struggle, because that continues to have most of the population, most of the electorate, in a trance, chasing ineffective solutions to problems that they can't themselves measure the efficacy of. So yeah, that was, I believe, the 17th essay of the Abolition for the People series. Super article, yeah, I agree. Really good read. We are reading one of these per week, as long as the internet doesn't fail out, and we're over halfway done, so looking forward to continuing that.